The stars above Earth had always seemed peaceful, distant, and indifferent. That illusion shattered the day. 17 ships appeared in high orbit, their hulls forged from a metal no human scanner could identify. They did not fire. They did not send warnings. They simply waited, silent and enormous, blotting out sunlight over 3 continents at once. Governments scrambled. Military satellites tried to lock onto the vessels and failed, their targeting systems overwhelmed by something that felt less like technology and more like a wall between worlds. 3 days later, a signal broke through every radio, television, and phone on the planet at the same moment. It was not garbled or alien-sounding. It was translated perfectly into every human language, spoken in a calm, almost bureaucratic tone that made the message feel even colder. It came from an entity calling itself the voice of the second speaker, a representative of something called the Galactic Council. The Council, the voice explained, was an alliance of 900 civilized species that governed nearly a third of the galaxy. Earth had been observed for over 2 centuries. Humanity had been classified, cataloged, and finally judged. The verdict was war. The reasoning, delivered with the same flat calm as a weather report, was almost insulting in its simplicity. Humanity was reckless. Humanity expanded too fast, consumed too much, fought itself constantly, and showed disturbing tendencies toward violence even against its own kind. Species like this, the voice explained, eventually became threats to galactic stability. The Council had seen it before. Civilizations that grew too aggressive too quickly were guided back into balance, sometimes gently, sometimes not. Humanity, unfortunately, had been placed in the second category. Earth's technology was primitive by galactic standards, its weapons crude, its ships slow. The Council did not expect a war. They expected what they called a correction phase, a short period of controlled destruction meant to humble the species into compliance, followed by generations of guided rebuilding under Council supervision. What they did not expect was for humanity to laugh. Not literally, not at first, but across command centers, war rooms, and eventually social media, a strange mood took hold. Fear was there, of course, genuine, bone-deep fear. Nobody was foolish enough to think an alien fleet capable of casually blotting out the sun was something to shrug off. But underneath the fear was something else, something the Council's analysts, watching from orbit, could not properly categorize. Defiance. Not the desperate defiance of a cornered animal, but something colder and more calculated. Humanity had spent its entire existence fighting itself, fighting disease, fighting famine, fighting the planet itself. War was not a foreign concept to be introduced to this species. War was something humanity had never, in its entire recorded history, actually stopped doing. The first official response came not from a president or a prime minister, but from a coalition of nations speaking together for the first time in decades, their leaders standing shoulder to shoulder in a broadcast scene by every human being with access to a screen. The message was short. Earth would not surrender. Earth would not be corrected. If the Galactic Council wanted a war, humanity would give them one, and it would not look anything like what the Council expected. Aboard the flagship of the invasion fleet, the second speaker reviewed this response with something between amusement and mild concern. Its species, the Threlkin, were an old and cautious people who had fought exactly 4 wars in their recorded history, each one meticulously planned, each one over quickly with minimal casualties on either side, because both sides valued efficiency and self-preservation above all else. War, to the Threlkin and most Council species, was a tool, brutal but rational, something you calculated the cost of before committing. The idea of a species choosing defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, simply because surrender felt worse than death, was not something their models accounted for. The second speaker ordered the correction phase to begin. It started exactly as planned. Council warships descended into the upper atmosphere over 12 major cities, deploying disabler fields designed to shut down electronic systems within a 50-kilometer radius without causing direct casualties. A demonstration of power meant to be terrifying but merciful proof that resistance was pointless without needless death. It was, by Council standards, an act of restraint. Humanity did not receive it that way. Planes fell from the sky over 3 cities before pilots managed emergency landings. Hospitals lost power in the middle of surgeries. Traffic systems collapsed, causing pileups that killed dozens. The Council had never fought a species dense enough, industrialized enough, and dependent enough on constant power that even a merciful attack caused this much immediate chaos. But the deeper problem revealed itself within hours. And it was this moment that Council historians would later mark as the true beginning of what humans would eventually call the Contact War. The disabler fields had shut down modern electronics. They had not shut down humanity's response. In the darkened streets of a dozen cities, people did not panic and freeze. They organized. Neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, ordinary civilians who had spent their lives training for disasters that never came. Storms, blackouts, earthquakes, and yes, even wars they hoped would never happen, began doing exactly what they had always practiced. Emergency generators older than the disabler technology's design parameters flickered to life, because nobody at the Council had accounted for the sheer number of backup systems humanity kept simply out of habitual paranoia. Radios older than satellite communication crackled with human voices coordinating relief efforts. Soldiers who had trained for decades in urban combat, guerrilla tactics, and asymmetric warfare against enemies with vastly superior resources, because humanity had spent the last century fighting exactly the kind of war against itself, began moving into position without needing to be told twice. The Council's analysts, watching the readouts from orbit, noted the anomaly with growing unease. Every other species they had subdued reacted to a demonstration of overwhelming force with the expected response. Shock, followed by attempts at negotiation, followed eventually by surrender once the futility of resistance became clear. Humanity's readouts showed something else entirely. Communication frequency between human factions, historically their greatest weakness, spiked upward instead of collapsing. Coordination between military and civilian groups, something the Council's models predicted would take weeks to establish under crisis conditions, was functioning within hours. It was as if the species had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of catastrophe for its entire existence. Not because it expected aliens, but because it had never really expected anything else from the universe except more disaster. The second speaker requested an updated projection from its tactical division. The division, for the first time in the history of the Council's expansion, returned no confident answer. Too many variables were shifting faster than their models could account for. Humanity was not behaving like a civilization being corrected. It was behaving like a civilization gearing up for the fight of its life, and doing so with an eerie, practiced calm that unsettled even the Council's most experienced war planners. On the ground, in a bunker beneath what remained of a major city's command center, a small group of military officers and scientists gathered around a table lit by battery-powered lamps. Among them was Dr. Elena Voss, a physicist who had spent the last 6 years working on a classified energy project that, until 3 days ago, nobody outside a small research team had believed would ever be needed. She looked at the general seated across from her, a woman named Adiz Okoye, who had commanded peacekeeping forces on 4 continents before this war began, and said the words that would later be repeated in every account of that first terrible week. "They think this is a correction," Voss said. "They think we're going to learn our lesson and behave. They don't understand that we've never once, in our entire history, learned that lesson from anyone." Okoye nodded slowly, studying a projection of the Council fleet's positions glowing faintly on a cracked tablet screen. "Then let's teach them something instead." Outside, in the darkened, power-starved streets, humanity was already beginning to move, not in panic, not in surrender, but in the slow, grinding, unstoppable way it always had when pushed into a corner. Nobody in that bunker, and nobody aboard the Council fleet above, yet understood exactly what they had started. But within days, both sides would learn that the greatest miscalculation in the Galactic Council's long history was assuming that humanity, faced with annihilation, would do anything other than fight back with everything it had, and then some it hadn't even known it possessed. The disabler fields lifted after 72 hours, exactly as the Council's protocols dictated. It was meant to be the next stage of the correction. Restore power. Let the humbled population see the full might of Council technology now that resistance had proven futile, and begin negotiations for humanity's surrender. That was the theory. The reality, as the second speaker would soon discover, was very different. When the fields lifted and city power grids flickered back to life, Council sensors expected to detect the signatures of a broken civilization, scattered communications, disorganized movement, the electronic quiet of a species licking its wounds. Instead, sensors lit up with something far more troubling. Military-grade, encrypted transmissions surged across every continent, dense and coordinated. Factories that had gone dark during the blackout roared back online within minutes, many of them already retooled by frantic engineers into something new. Air traffic control systems, restored to power, showed formations of aircraft that had not existed 72 hours earlier. Aircraft built in hours using blueprints humanity had shelved decades ago for being too expensive, too impractical, or too dangerous for peacetime use. None of those objections mattered anymore. Humanity, it turned out, had spent the better part of a century designing weapons it never had a good enough reason to build. Railguns capable of launching projectiles at speeds that made conventional missile defense obsolete had existed only as prototypes, shelved due to cost. Directed energy weapons capable of overloading shield systems had been developed and quietly buried after treaties discouraged their use against other humans. Autonomous drone swarms, capable of overwhelming any single point of defense through sheer numbers, had been banned by international agreement less than a decade earlier over ethical concerns. All of these programs, and dozens more like them, were reactivated within the first week of the war, dusted off by engineers who had once protested their existence and now begged to bring them back online. The Council had studied humanity's declared official military capabilities extensively over its 2 centuries of observation. What it had not accounted for was the vast, unofficial iceberg of technology humanity had developed and then hidden away out of its own fear of itself. Species on the Council had wars, yes, but they fought them within agreed limits, using weapons vetted and approved by governing bodies that valued predictability. Humanity had spent decades building doomsday devices and then arguing internally about whether using them would make humanity into monsters. That argument, as far as the second speaker could tell from the tactical reports flooding in, appeared to have been resolved rather suddenly in favor of survival. The first real battle of the war took place above the Pacific, where a Council cruiser moved to intercept what its sensors identified as a fishing fleet behaving erratically. The cruiser's shields, rated to withstand sustained assault from weapons far more powerful than anything humanity was believed to possess, failed within 4 minutes. The fishing fleet had been carrying modified railgun batteries, hastily welded onto civilian hulls by engineers working without sleep, firing tungsten rounds at velocities the cruiser's shield generators simply weren't calibrated to handle. The cruiser did not explode dramatically the way alien ships did in humanity's old films. It simply stopped functioning, drifting silently as its crew scrambled for lifeboats that, notably, humanity did not fire upon. That detail mattered more than the Council initially realized. Humanity was not committing genocide. Reports from the second speaker's own intelligence officers noted, with something like confusion, that human forces were consistently allowing Council crews to evacuate disabled vessels, even rescuing stranded crews from the ocean in several documented cases. This was not the behavior of the savage, uncontrollable species the Council's threat assessments had described. It was something stranger and, in its own way, more unsettling. A species fighting with terrifying efficiency and restraint at the same time, as if humanity understood perfectly well the difference between winning a war and becoming the monster it had been accused of being. Dr. Voss, still working out of the same underground command center, found herself increasingly pulled into strategic meetings far above her usual clearance level. The energy project she had spent 6 years developing, originally intended as a power source for deep space exploration, turned out to have a secondary application nobody had seriously considered until now. It could be weaponized into a localized field capable of disrupting the same kind of shield technology the Council relied on. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even reliable more than 60% of the time. But 60% was more than enough when humanity had the numbers and the desperation to keep throwing everything it had at the problem. "We're not fighting fair," Voss said during one meeting, watching engineers argue over deployment schedules for the modified generators. "We never have. That's kind of the whole point." General Okoye, standing at the head of the table, didn't disagree. Her forces had spent the past week coordinating what outside observers might have called chaos, but which followed, underneath the surface, of very old and very human logic. Overwhelm, adapt, exploit weaknesses faster than the enemy can patch them, and never, ever stop moving. It was the same logic that had driven human conflicts for thousands of years, scaled up now to a battlefield that spanned orbit and ocean and everything in between. Aboard the Council flagship, the second speaker convened an emergency session with its tactical council, the mood shifting from confident superiority to something approaching alarm. 3 more vessels have been damaged or destroyed in engagements that should have been trivial victories. Ground forces deployed to secure key locations on the planet's surface had encountered resistance not from organized military units, which the Council's forces were well equipped to handle, but from small, mobile groups of armed civilians who seemed to know the terrain intimately and struck with brutal precision before vanishing into cities, forests, and mountains that swallowed them whole. Council soldiers, trained for conventional warfare between disciplined, uniformed forces, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to follow any recognizable pattern. They're not a broken civilization. One of the second speaker's advisors admitted during the session, its voice carrying the particular strain of species unaccustomed to being wrong. They're treating this like every other war they have fought, which is to say, like the only thing that matters is winning it. The second speaker considered this for a long moment. 2 centuries of observation, careful cataloging, endless committee reviews. All of it had produced a picture of humanity as a dangerous, but ultimately manageable threat. A species that could be humbled with a firm enough demonstration of power. That picture, it was becoming clear, had been fundamentally incomplete. The Council had studied what humanity built. It had not adequately studied what humanity was willing to become when its survival was at stake. Down on the surface, in a makeshift command post built into the ruins of a bombed-out research facility, General Okoye received a report that would shape the next phase of the war. Scouts had identified a pattern in Council troop movements, a predictable rhythm to their patrols and supply routes that suggested a military culture built around efficiency and minimal risk, not adaptability under chaos. It was, Okoye realized, looking at the data with a grim sort of satisfaction, a weakness that could be exploited again and again. "They fight like accountants," she said to the room. "Careful, efficient, minimizing losses on both sides because that's what their models tell them to do." She tapped the map in front of her, tracing a line through contested territory. "We're not going to fight like that. We're going to make them spend every single day of this war wondering what we're going to do next, because the truth is, half the time, we don't know either. And that's going to terrify them more than any weapon we could ever build." Above the planet, the second speaker stared out at the blue world below, a world it had once considered a straightforward correction, now revealing itself to be something far more dangerous than any threat assessment had predicted. For the first time since the Council's founding, the question was no longer how quickly humanity would surrender. It was whether the Council could survive a war against a species that had never, in its entire bloody, brilliant history, known how to lose gracefully. 3 weeks into the war, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session far from Earth, in the great orbital hall above their capital world, where representatives from all 900 member species gathered to review what had, until recently, been considered a routine correction operation. The mood in the chamber was tense in a way few present had ever experienced. Wars within the Council's history were rare, brief, and predictable. This one was neither brief nor predictable, and the casualty reports scrolling across the chamber's displays told a story that unsettled even species who had fought and won wars of their own. The numbers were staggering, but not in the direction anyone had expected. Council losses were mounting steadily, not from any single overwhelming human weapon, but from a relentless accumulation of small, unpredictable defeats. A supply convoy ambushed in the mountains of a region humans called the Andes. A reconnaissance squadron destroyed by weapons fashioned from decommissioned satellites, repurposed by engineers who treated orbital debris as a resource rather than junk. A diplomatic outpost, established under a flag of parley to discuss terms, evacuated in the middle of the night after intelligence suggested, correctly, as it turned out, that humanity had no intention of honoring any temporary ceasefire that didn't come with guarantees the Council wasn't prepared to offer. That last incident had become something of a flashpoint within the Council itself. Several member species argued that humanity's refusal to respect diplomatic norms proved exactly the point the original threat assessment had made. This was a savage, untrustworthy species that could not be reasoned with. Others, watching the same footage, drew a very different conclusion. Humanity did not trust the Council's diplomacy because humanity had spent its own history watching diplomacy get used as a stalling tactic while stronger parties regrouped. They weren't refusing to negotiate out of savagery. They were refusing because they recognized the tactic for what it was, having used it themselves more times than any Council historian cared to count. The second speaker, addressing the chamber directly for the first time since the war began, chose its words carefully. We assessed this species based on its technology and its declared capabilities. It said, the translated words carrying a weight of reluctant admission rarely heard in Council proceedings. We failed to adequately assess its will. This is not a species that fights to preserve a way of life. This is a species that has never known peace long enough to become comfortable with it. War, to them, is not an aberration. It is simply another Tuesday. The comment drew murmurs across the chamber, some skeptical, some deeply concerned. A representative from a species known for cautious, methodical strategy, the same species that had first proposed the correction in the first place, rose to challenge the assessment. Surely, it argued, humanity's resistance would eventually collapse under the sheer material advantage the Council possessed. 900 species, thousands of ships, resources humanity could not hope to match in a prolonged war of attrition. Time, it insisted, was still on the Council's side. It was a reasonable argument, grounded in Council military doctrine that had proven successful in every previous conflict. But down on Earth's surface, in command bunkers and improvised war rooms, humanity was proving remarkably good at making time work against its enemy instead. Every week the war dragged on. More of humanity's shelved, forbidden, and half-finished technology found its way into active deployment. Every week, human engineers reverse-engineered another piece of captured Council technology, closing the gap in capability faster than anyone on the Council side believed possible. And every week, more of the Council's carefully cultivated alliance began to fray, as member species who had signed on to a quick, low-cost correction operation found themselves committing more ships, more resources, and more of their own people to a war that showed no signs of ending quickly. Dr. Voss, exhausted but wired on adrenaline and too much coffee, stood beside General Okoye in what had become their permanent command center, watching real-time footage from a captured Council vessel currently being dismantled by a team of engineers 3 levels below them. The vessel, brought down over the Atlantic 2 days earlier using a combination of Voss's shield disruption technology and a swarm attack that would have been unthinkably reckless against a human military, but proved devastatingly effective against Council doctrine, represented the single greatest intelligence windfall of the war so far. Their shield technology is elegant, Voss admitted, scrolling through data pulled from the ship's core systems. Genuinely elegant. But it's built for efficiency, not resilience. They designed it to work perfectly under expected conditions. They never designed it to survive something that refuses to behave the way it's supposed to. Okoye allowed herself a small, tired smile. Sounds familiar. It wasn't just weapons technology that humanity was adapting and improving. Word of the war, filtering slowly through council channels to other species living under council governance. Some willingly, some far less so, had begun to spark something the council had not anticipated at all. Sympathy, and in some cases, quiet support. Several smaller species, long resentful of council oversight but too weak individually to resist it, began making contact with human forces through back channels, offering intelligence, technology, and in a few remarkable cases, direct military assistance. Humanity was fighting the council alone, but it was no longer fighting entirely without friends. One such contact came from a species called the Virile, a small but technologically sophisticated people who had been under council administration for nearly a century after a correction of their own decades earlier. Their initial message, translated and delivered to General Okoye's command center, was brief but significant. We have watched you fight for 3 weeks longer than we managed to fight in our own war. We would like to help you succeed where we did not. The offer came with technical schematics for council communication systems, detailed knowledge of fleet supply routes, and something even more valuable, confirmation that the council's confidence, both militarily and politically, was far more fragile than its official statement suggested. Member species were growing uneasy. The cost of the war, in resources and in a growing sense that the council's judgment had been badly mistaken, was becoming difficult to ignore. Back in the orbital chamber above the council's capital, the debate raged on, but the numbers on the display screens told their own story regardless of what any representative chose to argue. The correction operation, budgeted and planned for a swift 6-week campaign, was entering its second month with no resolution in sight and mounting costs that several member species were beginning to openly question. The second speaker, watching the chamber divide into factions for the first time in decades, understood with growing clarity that the war it had been sent to conclude quickly was instead becoming the defining crisis of its long career. On Earth, humanity did not know about the growing cracks within council unity. Not yet. What it knew was simpler and more immediate. The enemy that had promised to correct them into obedience was bleeding ships, losing ground, and struggling to adapt to a war that refused to follow any of its careful, predictable rules. For a species that had spent its entire history being told, by itself as much as anyone, that its endless capacity for conflict was a curse, there was something darkly satisfying in discovering that the same trait the council had condemned them for was now the very thing keeping them alive. General Okoye gathered her senior officers one final time before the next phase of the campaign began, a coordinated offensive designed not just to defend Earth, but to strike directly at the council's supply lines and communication network across the system. It was an aggressive, risky plan, the kind of plan that would have been considered reckless by any conventional military doctrine. They think we're fighting to survive, she told the room, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into every face around her. They're wrong. We stopped fighting just to survive the moment we realized surviving wasn't good enough anymore. She looked around at the tired, determined faces of people who had spent weeks watching their world become a battlefield and had, somehow, not broken. Now we're fighting to win, and they have no idea what that actually means coming from us. The counteroffensive began at dawn over the eastern seaboard, though dawn meant very little to the crews of the modified vessels launching in a low orbit under the cover of a solar flare that Voss's team had, with remarkable precision, predicted would scramble council long-range sensors for exactly the window humanity needed. It was the kind of plan that relied on dozens of moving pieces working in perfect sequence, the kind of plan that should have had a dozen points of failure. It worked anyway, not because humanity had achieved some sudden technological parity with the Council, but because humanity had spent the last 6 weeks learning to exploit the gap between Council doctrine and Council reality faster than the Council could adapt. The target was a communications relay station positioned in high orbit, a critical node in the network the Council used to coordinate its fleet movements across the system. Destroying it wouldn't win the war outright, but it would force the Council fleet into a temporary blackout, unable to coordinate effectively for for the crucial hours needed for humanity's larger strategic plan to unfold. The strike force, a mixed formation of retrofitted military vessels and civilian ships pressed into service, moved with a coordination that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had only studied humanity's official, declared military capabilities. Aboard the Council flagship, the second speaker received the first reports of the attack with a growing, cold understanding that the war had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. Humanity was no longer simply defending its territory. It was taking the fight to the Council directly, striking at infrastructure deep within what had been considered secure space. The relay station's destruction, confirmed within the hour, sent a ripple of alarm through Council command that went well beyond the tactical significance of the loss itself. It was a statement, unmistakable in its intent. Humanity did not intend to wait patiently to be destroyed. It intended to win. What followed was the most intense period of the war so far. 5 days of continuous engagement across multiple fronts as humanity pressed its advantage while the Council scrambled to reorganize its fractured command structure. Ground forces, coordinated by General Okoye and a growing network of regional commanders who had spent the war learning to operate with minimal centralized oversight, launched a series of strikes against Council staging grounds established on the surface, using intelligence gathered from the viral and other sympathetic species to target locations the Council had considered secure. Dr. Voss, meanwhile, found herself at the center of what would later be remembered as one of the turning points of the entire war. Her modified shield disruption technology, refined over weeks of brutal trial and error, had been successfully miniaturized enough to be deployed not just on ships, but as a ground-based network capable of protecting entire cities from orbital bombardment. It wasn't perfect. Council engineers, growing increasingly desperate themselves, had begun developing countermeasures. But every countermeasure bought humanity time, and time, as it turned out, was the one resource humanity had learned to use more effectively than its supposedly superior enemy. The psychological impact of the offensive on Council forces proved just as significant as its tactical results. Soldiers and officers who had joined the correction operation expecting a brief, controlled campaign against a technologically inferior species found themselves instead fighting an enemy that seemed to grow more dangerous, not less, with every passing week. Reports of low morale began filtering back to Council command, along with a phrase that started appearing with increasing frequency in field reports from human territory, a phrase that would eventually become infamous throughout Council military history. Unpredictable hostile escalation. It was the closest the Council's rigid military terminology could come to describing an enemy that seemed to have no upper limit on how far it was willing to go to win. The truth was more complicated and more human than any Council report could capture. Humanity was not fighting without limits. Behind the scenes, in quiet conversations between military leaders and the civilian governments they answered to, difficult questions were being debated about just how far the war should be allowed to go, what kind of victory was worth pursuing, and what humanity would become if it let the darker corners of its arsenal define the shape of the peace that followed. General Okoye, more than most, understood the danger of winning a war by becoming indistinguishable from the threat that started it. "We are not doing this to prove we can be as ruthless as they think we are," she told a gathering of senior commanders during a rare lull in the fighting, her voice carrying the weight of a leader who had spent weeks making decisions with consequences she would carry for the rest of her life. "We are doing this to prove that we get to decide what kind of species we become, not them. There's a difference, and I need every one of you to remember it, especially when things get worse before they get better. Things that get worse before they got better." The Council, its fleet reorganized under new emergency command structures, launched a massive retaliatory strike intended to break humanity's resistance once and for all, targeting population centers directly in a departure from its earlier restraint. The attack caused devastating casualties, the single worst day of the war, and for a brief, terrible moment, It seemed as though the Council's brute force strategy might finally succeed where careful tactics had failed. It didn't. If anything, the attack accomplished the opposite of its intent, uniting a fractured, war-weary humanity behind a shared, unshakable resolve that had been fraying under the strain of weeks of continuous conflict. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Engineers who had been working themselves to exhaustion found new reserves of determination. Nations that had maintained careful diplomatic distance from the war effort threw their full support behind a resistance. The Council had intended to break humanity's will. Instead, it had reminded humanity exactly what it was fighting for and exactly what it stood to lose if it stopped. Word of the attack reached the Council's home chamber within hours, and this time, the debate that followed was different in tone from every session that had preceded it. Member species who had quietly supported the war effort now openly questioned its cost and its morality. The virile and several other species with their own painful history of Council correction used the moment to formally withdraw their support, a symbolic but significant crack in the Council's unified front. The second speaker, watching the chamber fracture in real time, understood that the war it had been sent to win quickly and cleanly had become something else entirely, a stain on the Council's reputation that would outlast the conflict itself, regardless of how it ended. Down on Earth's surface, in the ruins of a city that had borne the brunt of the Council's retaliatory strike, General Okie stood among the wreckage with Dr. Voss, surveying the damage in the pale light of early morning. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The cost of the war was written plainly across the landscape in front of them, and no tactical victory could fully erase the weight of what humanity had already lost and would likely continue to lose before this was over. They wanted to correct us, Voss finally said, her voice quiet but steady. Make us smaller, more manageable. Teach us our place in their galaxy. Okoye nodded slowly, looking out at the horizon where the last of the night's fires were finally beginning to die down. They're about to learn that we don't have a place we're willing to accept. Not from them. Not from anyone. She turned to face the small group of officers and engineers gathered behind her, people who had spent weeks turning exhaustion and grief into something resembling hope. We've bled. We've lost people we can never get back. But we're still standing, and every single day we stay standing is a day they have to explain to the rest of their precious council why this correction has cost them so much more than they ever expected. Above the planet, the council fleet regrouped for what both sides now understood would be the decisive confrontation of the war, a battle that would determine not just the fate of Earth, but the credibility and unity of the Galactic Council itself. Humanity, battered but unbroken, prepared to meet that confrontation on its own terms, carrying into the fight everything it had learned about itself over the past 2 months, that was capable of building nightmares when pushed to the edge, and equally capable of choosing, again and again, not to become one. Whatever happened next, one truth had already been proven beyond any doubt on both sides of the war. The Galactic Council had come to Earth expecting to correct a dangerous but manageable species back into obedience. What it found instead was a civilization that had never, in its long and violent history, needed anyone else's permission to survive and had absolutely no intention of starting now.